What's going on, everybody? Welcome back to the Cosmic Wonder. I'm your host, Warren Thompson, and Moon Knight episode 4 really made us go, what the heck is happening here? For those of you who are wondering what the heck was that ending about, don't worry, we're going to break it down and tell you everything you need to know, as well as break down some of the key moments from this episode that are very, very important. And of course, as it's been with Moon Knight so far, there's some ancient Egyptian things that we need to break down, like the Haka priests who were trapped inside of the tomb for centuries. How did they survive all of those years, and why are they so bent on harvesting organs? We'll explain that ending and break down everything you need to know in this video. And of course, if you're new, be sure to subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the latest videos. Now, the first part that we're actually going to start with is the ending, because a lot of people have no idea what is happening here. But they actually give us some big, major clues here to reveal kind of what's going to happen in the next episode. And I really got to give it to Marvel here. They really did an excellent job with this ending scene, making us wonder whether or not everything that we've seen so far is actually real, or perhaps it's simply in the mind of Marc Spector or Stephen Grant, and it was simply made up. Now, right off the bat, if you're wondering if everything that has happened so far and taken place during the Moon Knight series is real or not, it's real. And that's kind of the point of Moon Knight, to make you think, is this person just mentally ill? Or is everything that he's saying, that he's experiencing, actually true? Is he the avatar of Khonshu? Is he the moon's knight? This ending makes you wonder, but let's explain it. In the tomb of Alexander the Great, Arthur Harrow shoots Marc Spector in the chest twice. He then falls backwards into some water and begins to sink down, way down into what looks to be an abyss. And then it cuts to an old movie, and at first you have no idea what is going on here. It's an old Indiana Jones type of movie, and we find out later on that it's called Tomb Buster. Now, the confusion slowly starts to go away when you hear them talk about the Aztec goddess of the moon, kind of similar to Khonshu, who is the god of the moon in Egyptian mythology. But then it all clicks when we hear the name of this main character of the movie, and it is Stephen Grant. The camera pans out and we see that it's playing on a TV in an all-white room, and we quickly realize that this is a mental hospital, a psychiatric ward. And we start to see some pretty familiar people and things. Right away, we see a man with long blonde hair pull out some bingo numbers out of a hat. This is Steven's golden man friend, the one that he talked to in the first couple of episodes, and he's even holding the hat that he seemingly used to collect tips in. The camera pans and we see somebody playing with a Rubik's Cube, just like Steven would play with a Rubik's Cube at night to keep himself up. We then see one of the workers who was actually one of Harrow's agents. She was one of the persons who pretended to be a cop going to Steven's apartment and then took him to Harrow. Then she goes up to a patient, and the patient's name is Donna, and it is Steven's boss from work. We then see another worker who is Beck, who worked for Anton Mogart last episode. Notice that he's giving out cupcakes to patients, which is a direct reference to episode 1, where Steven was driving the cupcake van. He gives one to a patient who is drawing, and if we look at the drawing, she's drawing a bird and the head looks exactly like Khonshu's head. We then see somebody in the reflection of a window, and we see the goldfish that Steven had in his apartment on the right. Then a person comes into the picture who was the other agent of Harrow who pretended to be a cop that showed up at Steven's apartment and took him to Harrow. And he says, "All right, young man, the brakes are on and you're in your favorite spot." We then see Oscar Isaac in a wheelchair who is very, very confused, but a person quickly comes up to him, and this is Layla. And she mentions the movie and says that she changed it because they've watched it 5 times this week already. Now, Steven is very confused and he recognizes her and tries to call out to her. He tries to say Layla, but he is sedated and can't really talk right now as he has pretty much no control over his body. And it looks like Layla is a patient there as well. She sees Steven's bingo card and says that he won, but then she claims that she won, but promises she'll share the prize with him, implying that he's won before and she's taken it and kept it to herself. Now, Mark has no idea what is going on, but he looks into his reflection and he calls out for Steven, but Steven's not there. But he gets up and tries to go to the reflection, calling Steven's name out again. However, he trips over an ankle restraint, and this is just like the ankle restraint that he had in his apartment that kept him from getting out of his bed and running away. When he falls to the floor, he actually has a Moon Knight action figure in his hand. Steven stares at the figure on the ground, terribly confused, and then all of a sudden we are in a new place. This is the office of a psychiatrist that we know as Arthur Harrow. And the first thing that we hear him say is, "You've been having a great deal of difficulty differentiating between what is real and what is in your head." And here we really are made to believe that Stephen Grant actually is just suffering from a mental illness and that he is actually making everything up in his head. But here's where things start to take a turn and where we can determine that this scene right here, this whole scene in the hospital, is actually fake. Now, they really do a good job at trying to convince you it's real. The Doctor says he borrowed the movie that Steven watches, and he even says that he liked the villain and starts quoting things that we've heard Arthur Harrow say. He says the plot makes a big deal out of a lunar god, and then he says, "And didn't you say you worked for one?" And as he's talking, Mark is looking around and he's seeing some things that are very familiar. He sees a picture of the Swiss Alp Mountains, which is where he was in the first episode, and he sees Egyptian artifacts everywhere, and he sees Arthur's cane and the same slippers that we saw him wear before. And you can see him kind of start to think that, wow, he is crazy. He's mentally ill. And you can tell that a part of him is kind of defeated. But he snaps out of it when he hears the Doctor say, "I can't help you if you don't help yourself," because this is exactly what Arthur said right before he shot Mark. And then he tries to escape, and the Doctor says something very interesting if you listen to his words. He talks about how he knows how it feels to have a mental illness. He says, "I know, I truly understand how you're feeling. I too have suffered from mental illness, breaks in psychic awareness, depression," and it's interesting because it reflects what Arthur Harrow is to Marc Spector in real life, not this place, because remember, Arthur was the avatar of Khonshu before Mark. So Arthur, in real life, knows what it's like to be Khonshu's avatar. But Mark manages to escape and he goes down a hallway, and this is the first sign that none of this is real. The gravity sort of shifts in the hallway. It's almost like a scene from Inception. The lights all turn to one side, the carts start moving down the hall, but Steven runs down it, the light's still moving, and he puts himself in a room to hide. And again, another sign that this hospital isn't real. He goes inside the room and finds a sarcophagus in which Mark is inside of. The two of them are excited to see each other, but are also very confused about how everything is happening. And don't worry, I have thoughts. We're about to get to that, but let's talk about this final scene. Mark says that they need to get out of there, and Steven follows him. As they walk through the hall, they actually pass another room where the door is open, and we see another sarcophagus which is moving, much like how Steven was inside of the sarcophagus in the room that Mark went into. He was kicking and screaming to be let out of it, and this is basically the same thing. And I believe that there's another personality of Marc Spector inside of the sarcophagus, and I believe that it is Jake Lockley. In episode 3, we found out that there was another personality inside of the body that Mark or Steven didn't actually know about. The person that stabbed and killed those followers of Harrow. Steven said he didn't do it, and Mark said he didn't do it as well. Basically confirming Jake Lockley, who is another personality of Mark's from the comics, and I do believe that this person inside of that sarcophagus was Jake Lockley. Now, as they pass this room, Mark simply walks by it, but Steven takes a look and even points to it because he was just trapped in a sarcophagus himself, so he's clearly wondering what's going on there, but he continues to follow Mark. Until eventually a giant hippopotamus pops out of the doors and says, "Hi," in which immediately Steven and Mark freak out. Now, who is this giant hippopotamus? As you might have guessed, this of course is an Egyptian god. And if you know who this is, here's where things kind of start to come together. Sure, you can say that everything that we just saw in this final scene was in Steven's head, in Mark's head, and that he really is sick and this is just a mental episode he's having. But let's be honest, Marvel wouldn't do that to us, plus in the comics that's kind of a thing as well, but Moon Knight is proven to be real in the comics, and Khonshu is proven to be real as well. This is most likely taken place inside of Mark's mind as he kind of dies. Remember, he's died before and Khonshu brought him back to life. This is probably something very similar that is happening. And I actually think that he is kind of in some sort of a purgatory here. And here's the reason why. That giant hippo. That giant hippo is actually the Egyptian goddess Taweret. Taweret is the goddess of fertility and rejuvenation. She was considered a goddess of protection. Now, her role in Rejuvenation was rejuvenation of the dead, which I think is going to be part of how Mark/Steven kind of returned to life. Her role was also to purify the dead so they could go to the afterlife, which Steven actually mentions in the very first episode. He mentions the Field of Reeds, but before people can go to the Field of Reeds, they have to be judged first and their heart weighed on the scale, implying that there is a place they go before they can either go to essentially hell or the Field of Reeds, which is essentially heaven. And that's where I think Mark could be. Is it kind of in his head as well? Probably. But I do believe that this god, Taweret, is real. After all, it is a show about Egyptian gods, and we've already seen the real ones, which brings me to my next point, which is I think that Yatzil, the avatar of Hathor, and Hathor herself and other gods are actually here to help. Episode 3 made it very clear that there was some type of relationship between Khonshu and Hathor. Plus, not to mention, Yatzil actually helped Mark and, in turn, Khonshu after the meeting they had where they judged Harrow. So it seems to be pretty clear that Yatzil and Hathor are on the side of Mark/Steven and Khonshu, and they probably believe that Arthur is trying to resurrect Ammit, and that's obviously really bad, and the gods would want to stop that. Also, not to mention in this episode, it did show us a lot of other gods that were turned to stone, making it very clear that this council that they have is pretty quickly to judge, and probably some people in the council, the ones in charge, like the Avatar of Osiris, probably aren't the best type of people. And if you defy them, they'll probably turn you to stone, which is why I'm assuming Yatzil talked to Marc in secret. But I do believe that some of the gods are going to say, yes, Arthur Harrow is a bad guy. He is trying to resurrect Ammit, and we cannot have that, so we need to help Khonshu and Marc. And I believe that Taweret is one of those gods. I believe she's going to help Marc come back from the dead, just like Khonshu did, and heck, maybe she'll even help Khonshu escape. So, everything we've seen so far, that has happened. I do not believe that is fake. I do not believe that it was inside of Marc/Steven's mind. But again, kudos to Marvel Studios because they really do make you believe that at first. So that is the ending explained. But of course, there are other important parts to talk about of this episode. Like in the beginning scenes, the last thing that we saw in episode 3 was Steven and Khonshu turning back the sky. Steven mentioned that it was surprisingly painful, which causes him to pass out after it's done. And then of course Khonshu got turned into stone. Now the very opening scene of this episode is very peculiar. We see the Avatar of Osiris take the Ushanti of Khonshu and put it in a wall that has other statues of other gods turned to stone. And there were many gods here in the scene that were turned to stone before Khonshu, and it makes you wonder what exactly did they do? And I'm starting to think that the Avatar of Osiris and Osiris the god and other gods as well aren't exactly so good because they didn't even really hear Khonshu out. Khonshu was just trying to protect the world, trying to stop Arthur Harrow from resurrecting Ammit. They didn't even investigate at all. They were like, nah, it's fine. He's cool. And then after they turned Khonshu to stone, they even let him visit. Why? Now, Khonshu said that the gods turned their back on humanity. The gods kind of argued that humanity turned their backs on them, and this is very interesting because perhaps some of the gods could actually be bitter about this, and perhaps maybe some of them want Ammit to be resurrected and want Ammit to judge people. It seems like the gods kind of had enough of humans, and maybe Ammit is their answer to kind of get rid of the bad ones and only leave the good ones. I'm assuming that something like this is happening because I am definitely assuming that some of the gods aren't so good. And I'm assuming some of these gods that are turned to stone in this scene are the gods that went against them because they believed that they were bad. Now, as I mentioned, after Khonshu and Steven turned back the sky, Steven was left unconscious, which is where the beginning of the episode picks up. After Layla manages to defeat some bad guys, Steven finally wakes up and the two of them get in the car together and they go to Ammit's tomb. And here they confirm that Steven/Marc no longer has the suit. Layla says that was Marc's best feature, but he doesn't even have that anymore. But she still tells Steven that Marc is the one that is needed right now. They need the mercenary that can kill. However, Steven refuses because he said they had a deal. Once Khonshu was gone, Marc was gone. And Layla's pretty pissed at that, so Layla and Steven decide to do this themselves, which Steven is perfectly fine with because 1, he wants Marc completely gone, but 2, we all know that he's falling for Layla. Then Layla and Steven finally arrive to the site, in which Arthur and his men seem to already be inside of the site. They haven't found the tomb yet, but they are close. So Steven and Layla look for supplies before they go in, and Steven has a conversation with Marc. And this leads to a few events, but Marc realizes that Steven is indeed falling in love with his wife. But hey, I mean, they're the same person, you can't really blame him. But Marc does threaten him and says that if he touches her, he'll throw them off of a cliff. It's also very important to notice that Marc does say there's no more Khonshu, there's no more healing powers, no more suit, no more protection, and pretty much pleads his case to get him to take over the body, but Steven's not buying it because he's got Layla. Now, as Steven and Layla are gathering supplies, it cuts to some bloody crates and a bloody old knife. Now, eventually we do go on to find out what these are, so we'll talk about that in a bit. But of course, we have to talk about the scene that takes place right before Steven and Layla go into the site. Layla goes in to kiss Steven, but Steven is such a good guy that before she can kiss him, he actually tells her the reason Marc has been avoiding her. He says that Khonshu wants her to be the next Avatar. That's why he's been running away from her, to save her. However, Layla says that wasn't really his call to make. She needs somebody that's honest, in which she says that's Steven's thing. And Steven takes that as his sign to go in for the kiss. And he gets it, and she seems to enjoy it, but she's also kind of weirded out because it is her husband, but it isn't. Steven feels great though, but Marc manages to summon enough power to make Steven punch himself in the face. Now eventually Layla and Steven make their way down until they come into a room in which Layla discovers that the whole place is a maze. Luckily Steven is super smart at this stuff and he realizes that the maze is just an outline of the Eye of Horus. Now Steven's so smart that he knows that the Eye of Horus is also the eye of the mind and it represents the 6 senses, and there are 6 different ways that they could take in this maze. Therefore, if they figure out the Eye of Horus, they figure out which way they need to go. Now they realize that Amit's last avatar was a pharaoh, and that avatar would be the voice of Amit since it's Amit's avatar. So they determine that they should follow the line that symbolizes the tongue. So they make their way down that path, and this is where things get kind of interesting. They notice that the wall shows depictions of Haka priests. Layla states that they would have been put in the tomb with the pharaoh, so they could protect the pharaoh's body. She also explains that they were sorcerers of their time, and this is very, very important. Now, Haka is an Egyptian god. Haka is the god of magic and medicine in ancient Egypt, which is why she says Haka's priests are sorcerers. And the next scene really does kind of prove that they were indeed sorcerers. Now, since Steven and Layla had entered this site, they had noticed blood on the floor and gun shells on the floor, and they were wondering what exactly Harrow's men could be shooting at. Well, as it turns out, they were actually shooting at some of these priests who do seem to be magic, otherwise how would they survive over the centuries that they've been around? And it looks like they are doing exactly what they are supposed to do, be protecting the pharaoh's tomb, as these creatures are literally attacking Harrow's men and bringing them back and taking out some of their organs. Now, in ancient Egyptian times, priests of Aka were actually the doctors, because back then they believed magic and medicine were somewhat of the same thing. They believed that if a person got sick, it was because of a demon or a bad spirit, or it was the will of the gods. Essentially, something supernatural caused them to get sick, so they needed something supernatural to fight being sick, to get better. Enter the magic doctors. Now, why is this person collecting the organs of people? Well, we don't really know at this point in time, but perhaps there is a pharaoh that is still alive out there, or perhaps there is a god that these priests are collecting these organs for. But regardless, these people do seem to be a problem for everyone here, Arthur's people and Steven and Layla. Steven manages to squish one, but Layla encounters another one in a very Indiana Jones / Tomb Raider type of scene, so it appears that there are more than one. After all, Layla said that there would have been multiple ones as the painting showed us. Layla seems to have a thing of using flares to defeat bad guys, so that's what she does. And she manages to make it to the other side of this mine-like area. Now from here, there are 2 major scenes that we need to focus on. We're not focusing on the very end because we've already talked about that, but 2 main scenes here. And the first one is of Layla and Harrow. He tells Layla the truth. But the first thing to notice is that he says the name of Layla's father, Abdullah el-Fawli. Now this could actually be extremely important. It is a big Easter egg and could lead to Layla actually becoming a superhero. You see, in the comics, there was a person with a very similar name, Abdul Faul. The names are very similar, and in the comics, he is an archaeologist, but he is also the Egyptian hero known as Scarlet Scarab. Now, he has to be in possession of the ancient artifact known as the Ruby Scarab in order to harness its power, which consisted of superhuman strength, durability, flight, and the ability to drain others' powers. During World War II, Abdul protected the Egyptians during that time until one day the scarab vanished. He spent the rest of his life searching for it, but he never found it. Now, on his deathbed, he told his son about it and told him to continue the search, and eventually he did find it and he became the second Scarlet Scarab. Now, obviously, they changed things a little bit here, but think about why they would do that, because in Moon Knight's origins, the love of his life is Marlene, and her father was Dr. Alrun, and they completely changed that origin here. So, why did they change it? Could it be so that maybe one day in the MCU, Layla could be the Scarlet Scarab? After all, Arthur Harrow does say that her father used to call her my little scarab. Huge Easter egg here, and I think Layla is an excellent character and really wouldn't mind if she became a superhero. Now, on top of all this, we do hear the original origin story of Moon Knight. Arthur says he's going to tell Layla the truth, and that Mark knows the truth but won't tell her. He says that her father was murdered by mercenaries and nobody knew who they were. But Mark was there and he remembers everybody. Now we get the full story of this in the next scene when Layla confronts Mark. But first, Mark arrives to the tomb. As soon as he enters, he says that this pharaoh is going to be one of the big ones, but he could have never imagined who it was going to be. Mark immediately recognizes that it's Macedonian writing on the tomb. And the only pharaoh that was Macedonian was Alexander the Great. So Steven just starts to freak out. Now, Alexander the Great was a king of the ancient Greek kingdom of Macedon, and he is considered to be one of the greatest military leaders of all time. By the age of 30, he had created one of the largest empires in history, and he never lost a battle. And he was in many battles. He is still studied today by military leaders. But here's the thing, his tomb was actually lost. To this day, scholars cannot tell you where exactly the tomb of Alexander the Great is. A lot of people over time have claimed that they found it, but they've all been disputed. So the exact location right now pretty much remains unknown. Even though last year in 2021, Egyptian officials claimed that they had found Alexander the Great's tomb in Siwa Oasis, which is where Alexander the Great wanted to be buried, but scholars will say that he was not actually buried there, and the location of his tomb is still unknown. So this is a really cool thing that they throw into Moon Knight here. Now, Marc tells Stephen that he has to take the top off of the tomb and he has to look for the Ushabti. He's got to get it before Harrow does. And Stephen states that if you're going to hide it for all eternity, you probably put it in a place where the average looter wouldn't think to look. Now, what's important to note here is that Layla and Stephen in this episode determined that Amit's last avatar was a pharaoh. So in the MCU, Alexander the Great was Amit's avatar. So the Ushabti is on Alexander the Great somewhere. And Stephen determined since Alexander the Great was the avatar of Amit, he was the voice of Amit. So he probably hid the Ushabti down his throat. And as it turns out, he was right. He finds the Ushabti, which is a stone statue of Amit. So just like Khonshu and other gods were turned into stone, so was Amit. And this is what Harrow needs to bring her back to life. Now we know that they can come back to life because Khonshu told Stephen right before they turned back to sky, when Khonshu knew that he was going to be turned to stone, he told Stephen to tell Marc to save him. So clearly this can be reversed. So Stephen and Marc finds it, but their celebration is cut short because Layla is there and demands answers from Marc. Marc comes out and tries to get Layla to leave, but Layla thinks that he might have killed her father. So she demands answers. Marc says, "Of course I didn't kill your father, but he was there. He was one of the mercenaries." And here's the full origin story of how Marc Spector in the comics becomes Moon Knight. Marc says that my partner got greedy and he executed everyone at the dig site, which of course Layla's father was a part of and was executed. This is what happens in the comics. Marc's partner, Bushman, ends up killing archaeologists. And then Marc stands up to Bushman, but Bushman defeats him. And this is pretty much what he tells Layla here. He says, "I tried to save your father, but I couldn't save him." And he says that he shot him too, and he was supposed to die that night, but he didn't die that night. Now, he doesn't say so to Layla here, but this is how he becomes Moon Knight. In the comics, Bushman shoots him, and he actually does die, but he dies right in front of a statue of Khonshu, and Khonshu revives him, brings him back to life, under the condition that he be his Moon Knight, the Fist of Khonshu, and that's how Moon Knight is born, and it sounds like the story is pretty much the same in the MCU. However, the only exception is, in the comics, although the people are different, the archaeologist's daughter was actually at the site, and she witnessed everything go down. Clearly, Layla was not there as she does not know what happened. But it looks like Marc met Layla because he felt so bad about her father being executed. He wanted to track her down to apologize to her, but he couldn't. He couldn't bring himself to tell her, but she realizes this and she says, "This is why we met. Marc just had a guilty conscience." Now they're about to get into it even more, but Arthur and his men, they come. Layla hides, but Marc doesn't go down without a fight. He grabs the Pharaoh's axe, which actually looks exactly like Moon Knight's grappling hook from the comics. The markings are even kind of similar. Marc kills a couple of Harrow's guys, but then Harrow shoots him twice in the chest, and it looks like he dies. And of course, you have heard my opinion on this because we started by talking about this ending here. So be sure to let me know your thoughts about this episode in the comments down below. Were you freaked out by that ending? And where do you think Marc and Stephen are right now? Leave your comments down below. Don't forget to like the video and subscribe so you don't miss out on any of the latest Marvel videos. For live updates, you can follow me on Instagram and Twitter. And as always, thank you all so much for watching. Woof woof.